Hey people, this is Eric. I'm here to talk about an interesting paper named Why Monogamy is Morally Permissible. It's by a philosopher named Kyle York. And, the reason I chose this paper is because I've always been fascinated by unexplained or esoteric norms of human behavior, such as listening to music or dancing. But I'm also very skeptical of them because many of them, such as warfare, lead to a morally dark place if we don't check them. Monogamy is like this to me. It's not unheard of outside of humans per se. I mean, there are animals that mate for life, but this is rare. And looking at the divorce rate and the number of unhappy relationships out there, it makes me wary. Besides, there are other structures we could use to build meaningful relationships. So why monogamy? Now, this might be explained along the lines of, human children takes decades to leave the nest with a fully mature brain. And humans are sexually dimorphic at a 1 male to 1 female ratio. Monogamy maximizes the reproductive and security needs for a successful species. But monogamy doesn't seem like the only option here. There is evidence that polygamy was common with our ancestors, and they formed communal or tribal structures where they shared resources and affections, including sex, with more than one person. But I digress. Nowadays, we have the luxury of choice. So what I am curious about is whether monogamy still holds up as a morally justifiable practice. My impression of monogamy is that it's kind of like carnivory. Our ancestors ate meat out of necessity, and meat was plentifully available as an energy resource. Nowadays, though, there is a growing question as to whether this is actually okay. Monogamy seems like this to me. It's a cultural norm that came to be out of practical purposes, but today it is grandfathered into modern life. York aims to show that monogamy is actually morally permissible, and he does so with 3 defenses. One from practicality, one from specialness, and one from jealousy. We'll be taking a look at what that means and whether the arguments are actually any good. And I'll go ahead and start by giving a little bit of background. So the paper here addresses people like Harry Chalmers, a philosopher among a growing body of philosophers who argue that monogamy is actually immoral. Now, Chalmers here has a similar intuition about romantic relationships that I do, that romantic relationships have unclear, if not lacking, justification for the kind of restrictive agreements that they impose, right? Because these restrictive agreements are burdens, right? So like in a friendship, if someone said, hey, I'll be your friend, but you can't go to the movies with anybody else and you can't play video games with them, and actually you can't have friends other than me. Well, that would seem unacceptable. Like, why would you want to be friends with somebody like that, right? And yet somehow this gets a free pass in romantic relationships. You'd have to argue here that romantic relationships are somehow different from friendships, and so they get away with doing this. But how, right? Like, what is the actual difference between a romantic relationship and a friendship? In fact, I would say it seems that anything you can do with a friend, you can do with a partner, and vice versa. You want to sleep with a friend, you can do that, and you can do that with a partner. You can move in with a partner, and you can move in with a friend. So what is actually different here? Another problem is moving from some different type of relationship to a romantic one, right? So moving from strangers to friends seems pretty straightforward. You don't know somebody, and as you get to know them, you develop common interests, and you like each other's presence. So there's this good making that happens naturally. In fact, most friendships are not declared, right? You don't declare, hey, should we be friends? It just kind of happens, and the delineation is, pretty clear. But it's not as clear with romantic relationships, because romantic relationships happen in all sorts of ways. They can be from going from friends to romantic partners. They can be going from strangers to romantic partners, and they could happen explicitly, like a confession. They could declare that they want to be partners with you, but they don't have to happen that way. So how do we even move from one to another? Another point is that sexual fidelity is unusually placed, right? So like, why sexual fidelity out of all kinds of possible fidelities? For example, there's no family fidelity where your family says you can't be family with anybody but us. So, they can't do that, right? Because romantic relationships often lead to the formation of new families, and that's fairly expected. But even in monogamous relationships, right, there is no child fidelity where you tell your partner you can't take care of anybody else's children but the one we have together. That seems like some kind of restriction, but we don't impose that. Instead, we impose sexual fidelity. So why, right? Well, York here needs to show that these delineations are clear, that romantic relationships really do provide something different. And therefore, he will imply that monogamous restrictions are therefore justified. So let's take a look at his first argument, shall we? Firstly, York argues that monogamy could be more practical for some people, that monogamy allows for more resources and more investment because there's only one person to worry about. In monogamy, you could adjust your character to mesh with your particular partner, whereas in polygamy, you would have to be switching depending on who you're with, and you would have to be learning a lot more to accommodate each person's preferences. But also, monogamy makes changes easier. Each individual partner in a non-monogamous relationship has to come to an agreement before changes are pushed through, whereas in monogamy, you only really have to convince one. For example, if you wanted to move and you were in a monogamous relationship, then convincing your partner would be straightforward enough. You just have to convince that one person. They'd also be more invested and willing to move because they only have you, so they are more likely to negotiate. Whereas in a polygamous relationship, you would have to convince more people and they would all have different interests. They'd also be less likely to negotiate because they have other options, since they also have other partners. Chalmers seems to believe that monogamous agreements are responsible for many of the emotional burdens that arise in the romantic relationships we observe. For example, monogamous people tend to worry a lot about whether their partner is being faithful or whether they are spending enough time with their partner. And Chalmers believes that this stems from monogamous thinking itself. However, York believes that there is not enough evidence for this. I mean, there's also plenty of online spaces where non-monogamous people are complaining about how they wish they could go back to a regular monogamous relationship, or about how the drama is killing them. So this phenomenon of emotional stress that seems to come from monogamy might not actually come from monogamy, but from human nature. Chalmers argues against the notion that monogamy somehow helps with resource management, in that there doesn't seem to be a clear connection between sexual fidelity and resources. I mean, sex does divert time and attention, but not any more than a night out with friends would. So why is this such a sticking point with people who argue for monogamy? Well, York argues that this is true in theory, but in practice, sex is an intimate activity and it promotes relationship building. And this does actually permanently affect the resources that can be given by one partner to another. I mean, If one partner is with a different person, then they might develop feelings. They might be persuaded that the current relationship isn't worth maintaining, or that they should lower the investment that they are placing on their current relationship. So even though it seems like it is not different than a night out with friends in theory, in practice, there is longer term effects to sexual infidelity. There are some issues with the argument of practicality. An obvious objection one could make is to say, so what that monogamy is more practical? How does monogamous practicality connect the enforcement of exclusive clauses with moral permissibility? Right? Uh, in fact, there seems to be a definitional issue here because monogamy can refer to two things. One is a contingent romantic relationship that contains only two people, and this doesn't say anything about the kinds of agreements present in this romantic relationship. And the other is a romantic relationship that enforces sexual exclusivity, right? Chalmers is clearly addressing the latter type, but the argument for practicality seems to only defend the first type. For instance, there can be a mutual understanding between a couple that monogamy is the most practical way to do relationships, but that doesn't mean that they must have exclusivity agreements of any kind in their relationship. So, okay, fair enough. York might say monogamy is immoral in this circumstance, but it only has to be acceptable under a different circumstance for my case, right? And I would agree with him on that. But it seems that the practicality defense can only support a contingent monogamy without clear exclusivity agreements. Even if sexual exclusivity discourages the diversion of resources, like York argues, that advice makes a good case for an individual to practice monogamy for themselves and in a relationship, but they can't enforce it. And I think that's the main problem Chalmers has, is the enforcement of sexual exclusivity. A naturally occurring romantic relationship that just so happens to begin with two individuals isn't morally obligated to acquire more, right? And that's fine enough. The practicality defense does do a good job of justifying a relationship like that and its existence. Next, York appeals to the specialness of a monogamous relationship, that it's unique and ought to be protected as such. Privacy, for example, is an important quality that many people value for very good reasons, right? But privacy is much easier to get with monogamy than with non-monogamy. I mean, the fact is, having a partner to share personal information with is also the means by which that information can be leaked or can be used against you. And of course, the risk of information leakage or misuse increases with every partner that you add to the relationship. Now, this can lead to the enforcement of monogamy, and it is entirely rational. It doesn't come from a lack of trust necessarily. There could be misunderstandings or false presumptions by your partner about where the boundaries are, and enforcing exclusivity agreements just prevents this whole mess from happening in the first place. Also, shared identity is important to many people as it helps them build intimacy and trust in their relationships. Exclusive agreements are a part of that shared identity building process. And now, many exclusive agreements are psychologically beneficial. I mean, there's a reason why people make secret handshakes and share them only with their close friends, right? York argues that sex is the most obvious choice for shared identity and might actually explain the goal of monogamy. I mean, sex is desired by most people, but it is by its nature a very vulnerable, intimate, and trust heavy activity. So many people only engage sexually with people that they trust deeply. Well, the shared identity gained from making sex exclusive helps build the trust and also the privacy necessary for partners to feel comfortable having sex. Therefore, shared identity is desirable. Well, I think the argument for privacy is a fantastic argument. It puts monogamy as the only solution for some people who really value their privacy, but they also want a good romantic relationship. And it also gives a very good reason to enforce monogamy. Something that bothers me here, though, is the implication that shared identity is somehow inherently good or desirable. I mean, shared identity, from my experience, often comes with like bullying and tribalism and all sorts of nasty negative integration stuff. It's not clear to me that shared identity is something that we should go for in every case. And each case does have to be evaluated for shared identity in order for us to build a case that it is any good. But York doesn't feel the need to explain himself, and I'm not clear. I'm not sure why he chose this route. But well, if I were to evaluate monogamy, it seems that it just you just build shared identity with monogamy at the expense of freedom. And this is a complicated argument. It's not clear whether exchanging freedom is always wrong. But it definitely is not this. It definitely isn't good enough on its own to warrant this argument. And I just think that you really can't argue using shared identity. Another thing that I was thinking was, isn't this argument like really good for all kinds of relationships, right? Like if I were in a friendship and I wanted to make exclusive agreements, which we presumed up till now were wrong. And for example, let's say I wanted to make a secret handshake with a friend, and that friend cannot use that handshake with anybody else but me, right? It seems that this shared identity argument works to defend this kind of practice. And of course, an anti-monogamist might argue that sexual exclusivity is a big deal and it's just too restricting, but they'd have to make that case. Still, though, I mean, it seems then that these arguments for privacy and this argument for shared identity, should also be considered in friendships. For his final argument, York claims that monogamous agreements can help some couples avoid immoral actions, such as those brought about by certain jealousies, but it also helps prevent immoral situations from occurring and immoral decisions from being taken. Now, a natural objection to monogamy that prevents many people from engaging in monogamy in the first place is that it seems to instigate sexual jealousy, which feels bad and is probably immoral. So then, how can monogamy prevent what it brings about, right? Monogamy obviously can't prevent jealousy if it is a cause of jealousy. And to that, York does admit that monogamy can't prevent sexual jealousy. But he argues that monogamy isn't the cause of jealousy. So while it can't prevent sexual jealousy, it could prevent other types of jealousies. Now, we do know that non-monogamous relationships, jealousies other than sexual jealousies can arise, right? So there's reports of people feeling frustrated that their partner isn't spending enough time with them as they are with the other person, or that one of them is not contributing enough to the relationship, perhaps. And this implies that jealousy doesn't disappear with non-monogamy. And because it doesn't disappear, then monogamy can't be the cause of jealousy. It's got to be something deeper. Then that means that monogamy could potentially prevent certain immoral situations from happening. For example, many polyamorous people will inevitably confront the decision of who to live with and therefore who to spend the most amount of time with. And if the situation is such that not everyone can't move in together, then they will have to decide to live with one person, knowing that their other partner will be crushed. And this situation is deeply concerning and probably immoral. So York is arguing here that monogamy prevents these situations from happening in the first place. Another uncomfortable situation of non-monogamy is that in non-monogamous relationships, the primary partner or the person who came first will make commitments that will take up resources naturally and will prevent the relationship's own undermining. So maybe they'll say, hey, every weekend we should cook together or something like that. And this makes it harder for newer members to form their own commitments because, well, they'd have to fight against the time and the resources that the first member already committed. And this means that secondary partners get the short end of the stick and that non-monogamy is unusually cruel to up-and-coming secondary partners. Now, monogamy helps prevent these kinds of situations from happening where if a new person comes in, then they'll have to be constantly fighting for the same time and attention. Now, Chalmers brings in a study that correlates people in non-monogamous relationships with being less jealous than their monogamous counterparts. So it seems that there's a positive relation between monogamy and jealousy, right? But York keenly points out that there is a correlation causation issue here. It's possible that non-monogamous couples are just not initially predisposed to experiencing jealousy in the first place, right? So it's not that non-monogamy disincentivizes jealousy or that monogamy is inherently jealous, but that those who are open enough to try non-monogamous solutions would already be less predisposed to jealousy than their more traditionalist counterparts. All right, hold on tight because I have a lot to say about this one. Firstly, it's a good thing that he doesn't advocate for monogamy, but instead argues for simply permitting it. That monogamy can help some people avoid moral dilemmas is enough for monogamy to be permissible and useful, but definitely not enough to make it better. So if someone doesn't experience much sexual jealousy, but shakes at the thought of being treated unequally in a love triangle, then monogamy will work for them. Of course, it will be a lot worse for somebody else who experiences the reverse. York argues that anxieties about fidelity and jealous insecurities are problems that at least don't come from monogamy itself. This is clear enough. A monogamous couple could enforce monogamous agreements without any anxiety or jealousy present. Maybe they do it out of tradition or something. So this argument successfully defends monogamy, but I think it's a bit of a Pyrrhic victory. It's important to note that York acts very consequentialist and practically to say that avoiding greater immorality, like a jealous outburst, is overall good even at the cost of a smaller immorality, like the restriction of sexual freedoms. And I value freedom very highly, so while this seems somewhat unsettling, I'll admit that enforced monogamy that successfully prevents a jealous outburst seems to do good. This line of reasoning, though, has the unfortunate effect of placing enforced monogamy as an inferior relationship solution, given that moral purity in them seems just completely impossible. Enforced monogamy is only the moral choice if a partner has an insecurity that makes all other options completely unavailable. I'll go ahead and add that if we are acting like consequentialists here, then Anti-monogamists can argue that the monogamous standard exacerbates the type of thinking that builds these insecurities in the first place. That Chalmers study supports this idea, not the inherent properties of monogamy. So, monogamy as the default form of romantic relationship should still be discredited on the practical grounds, even if it's not inherently immoral. And I'll admit that the idea of monogamy itself isn't the direct cause of insecure thinking, but if we can rid ourselves of the expectation of monogamy and its ugly enablements, then maybe we ought to, and we can do so by denouncing it. York thinks it's not fair to expect everyone to be able to find peace and compersion, but at least I believe these are fantastic expectations to strive for, and the anti-monogamist has a great cause to stand against monogamy, at the very least as the cultural norm. All right, I think we have a good idea of what the arguments are and some objections you might have to them. So what do I think of all this? Did I change my mind, perhaps? Well, before reading this paper, monogamy to me just seemed outright immoral. The distinction between friendships and relationships has never been clear to me, so the restrictive agreements of monogamy were completely unjustified. However, the argument from practicality has convinced me that contingent monogamy is probably the best form of relationship. It couldn't support an enforced monogamy, but otherwise it was a great case. As for the argument from specialness, I was so thoroughly convinced by the argument from privacy that I believe exclusive agreements are okay even in other relationship types if they are for the sake of privacy. Not so much with shared identity though. Shared identity is already problematic on its own, and I think I've expressed that enough. The jealousy argument, well, it just made me feel sad. But it did convince me of a special case for enforced monogamy. Though maybe romantic relationships in general ought to be avoided if one is prone to unbearable jealousies. Importantly, the argument only justified enforced monogamy under a very narrow set of conditions, which still leaves most real cases of this kind of monogamy completely undefended. So yeah, that's Why Monogamy is Morally Permissible by philosopher Kyle York. So go check out his other work and maybe leave a comment about what you think. I'll be reading those. Until next time, take it easy.